Good morning. Today is the 17th of Iyar, the 8th of May. And we're holding by the first and second readings of the double parshas, Behar-Bechukotai. And the beginning of Behar is about the mitzvot, the commandments that are related to the agricultural work done on the land. And afterwards, not just the agricultural work, but also the deed, the title to land, which is the second reading. The first reading includes the discussion of the sabbatical year, the seventh year of every 7 years, just as we have a seventh day, Shabbat, when we don't work the world, as it were, we don't work our lives, but rather we rest. So there is a commandment to not work the land on the seventh year. Now, it's a little bit more complex than just saying not working it, because there's a lot of things that are possible and things that aren't, and it depends. It's different than the concept of Shabbat in many ways, but it's also very similar in the basic concept, which is that we take a break for a year. Then we learn about the Jubilee year, what we call the Yovel. Yovel is translated in English into Jubilee. It's not really a translation, it's more like a transliteration. And that is the 50th year, meaning that we have 7 times 7 years, 7 cycles of 7 years, and each 7th year is a sabbatical, is a Shnat Shmita, as it's called in Hebrew. And then after 7 such cycles are complete, there is one more year called the Jubilee, the Yovel, the 50th year. And you'll notice that this is, of course, the same pattern as Sefirot Omer, as counting the Omer. 7 weeks, 7 times 7, 49 days, and then the 50th day is Shavuot. So here too we have in the level of years, the 50th year is called the Yovel. And what's interesting about this, there's a lot of incredible things that came out of this. The first thing to see is that this is really one of the clearest gateways into the Zohar, into the mystical thought of Judaism. We're one day before Lag BaOmer, tomorrow, which is traditionally celebrated as the day of passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's not clear if it was really his day of passing or it was some other holiday that he instituted. Certainly this was a special day because on this day the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying in either a plague or the war that they were engaged in. It's not clear exactly what the reason was, but they stopped dying on this day, the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. So this really is, this parsha, which is usually read in connection with Lag BaOmer, either the Shabbos before or the Shabbos after, and this week it'll be the Shabbos after. It provides us a really beautiful gateway into understanding how the Zohar works and how it thinks. So we have here this concept of the 50th being a Jubilee year. And how does the Torah describe this year? It says in verse 10, we're in Leviticus 25, verse 10, וקידשתם את שנת 50 שנה וקראתם דרור בארץ לכל יושביה, יובל היא תהיה לכם, ושבתם איש על אחוזתו ואיש על משפחתו תשובו. Okay, so I'll read the translation into English. You must sanctify the 50th year. You must proclaim freedom throughout the land for all. To those who live in the land of Israel, you must designate this year as the Jubilee. Each of you must return to his landed property. Each of you must return to his family. So what is going on here? So there's a lot of going back, a lot of return to the origin. Indentured servants who decided to stay with their master for more than the allotted 7 years, and they stay until the Jubilee year, and then they are freed. They can't stay any more than that. That's the maximum. So they go back to their families. The land of Israel cannot be sold, meaning it's only inherited, and even if someone decides to sell an inheritance in the Jubilee year, the inherited land goes back to its original owner. So you can only buy in Israel land, in the land of Israel, you can only buy the land for a set amount of time, for at most 50 years. By the way, this was something that the modern state of Israel took advantage of, and they claimed in the beginning that whatever was called lands that belonged to the government, that they were not in private hands, were only being rented out. There's a different word that they use except for renting, but I don't remember what it is in English. It's only being rented out for 50 years at most, 49 years. After that, they realized after a while that this was not a good deal for them because they didn't actually want the land back. But that was that's a whole different issue. But this very interesting concept, when you live in the land of Israel, the land is not yours. Now, today in the modern times, we don't have the division of the land to the Jewish people by a raffle, as it was done by the prophet. So there is private ownership, but in principle there is no private ownership, and so the land returns back to its original owner. It too returns. This whole idea of things returning, let's see what we had in this verse. The Jubilee is the 50th year. It's a year of freedom. It's a year that things return back to their original place or their original owners. And you need to sanctify it. These are all connected to what later in the Zohar is called the Sefirah of Binah, of understanding. There are 50 gates of understanding. We understand that there are, we find that there is this concept of 50 associated with the Sefirah. Understanding is basically one of the intellectual powers of the mind. But in the Zohar, it goes through an abstraction. And in its abstraction, we find that it has 50 gates. What are these 50 gates? So there are three different explanations in the Zoharic literature. One is that this is 50 times that the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned in the Torah. Another is that it's the 50 times in which God is described in some kind of anthropomorphic idiom. For instance, the hand of God. God doesn't have a hand, but when we say that, it's a bina, it's an understanding, sphere of understanding type of concept. So it's related to the number 50. It's also related to the concept of freedom. What's the connection between Yovel and freedom? So here we see that indentured servants go free. But in the thinking of the sages of the Zohar, what that means is that the Sefirah of Bina, or the Yovel in general, is a symbol for the world to come, the world of freedom. That's what it's described as, the world of redemption. When you say redemption, what do you actually mean? You mean that someone has been redeemed, he goes free. So the Sefirah of understanding is related to the world to come, not the world to come in the afterlife, but rather the world to come when we will be free of the evil inclination. The main thing that a person needs to free himself from in this world is his subservience to the negative inclination inside of him that hampers all of his progress, all that he does. So that is related to understanding also. But we saw here the concept of return. Return, literally in Hebrew, is the word teshuvah. Teshuvah means to return to the origin, to return to God. And so that's why Binah, Yovel, is also related to the concept of tshuva, of returning to God. So all these concepts go together in the Zohar, and they're explored continuously, and the Zohar builds a whole abstract layer, one would say, over the literal reading of the Torah. We mentioned the idea that Yovel, that the 50th year, that Bina, which is related to the 50 gates of understanding, is connected to redemption. How do you say redemption in Hebrew? So the word is Geula. And we find here, if we look in today's reading, the second reading, so we'll find that it says like this. if your brother Israelite becomes destitute and therefore sells some of his inherited land, this land may later be redeemed. Geula. His redeemer, who is related to him, the redeemer is called a goel, someone who gives geula, comes forth and redeems that which his relative has sold. If a man does not have a redeemer, but he obtains the sufficient means on his own to afford its redemption, he can redeem the land. Geula tiyeh la'aretz, it's called. The land will be redeemed. We find the concept of redemption in 3 different places. There is redemption geula, which is related to the person who is a blood relative of someone who was murdered. They have a duty, as it were, or at least they're given the possibility of avenging the blood of their relative that was murdered. That is the first type of geula we find in the Torah. The second type is the geula we see here with the land, that the land is redeemed. It goes through geula and it goes back to its original owner. The third type is maybe the most interesting type, is that the person who marries a woman from his family who did not have children, whose husband passed away and did not have children, is called a goel. He's also called a redeemer. These 3 types of redemption, they're all related to Bina. They're all related to how we free things in the world. The blood relative is freeing the family from the burden of the murder, from the pain of the murder. He's also freeing, in a sense, the murderer from his liability. The freedom of the land is very clear, and the woman is being freed from her isolation, from her mourning over her husband and not having children. But these 3, they correspond to the Baal Shem Tov's famous threesome called submission, separation, and sweetening. To redeem the murderer, to avenge the blood of the murderer, that is the submission, obviously, because we are submitting. You can actually kill the murderer, or at least he forces him to stay his whole life in a city of refuge. The redemption of the land is what we call separation. Separation is figuring out what is the true identity of the land. So the land really belonged to a different family, and now it's going back to its original place, to its original source. The redemption of the woman who had no children, the woman who needs to be married again, and by a relative, is the redemption which is sweetening. It sweetens her whole existence. There's a lot more to be said about this, but we'll finish here today. Maybe we'll continue a little bit more with this tomorrow for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and or we'll do something a little bit different in relation to Lag BaOmer. Hope to see everyone tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a good day.